What would make an entire country publicly snub a royal prince? Twice? Not just a former prince, but one who once stood on a sunlit stage in Sydney, wrapped in the warm embrace of thousands, with cameras flashing and flags waving. A prince who had, for a moment, seemed to capture the soul of a nation that didn't even share his passport. And now, that same country has quietly, but unmistakably, turned him away. No press conference, no red carpet, no official visit, just silence. A silence louder than any rejection letter. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And it didn't stop there. Because when Harry and Meghan were reportedly informed that Australia was not interested in a second unofficial tour, the response from Montecito wasn't diplomatic. It was nuclear. Staffers say doors slammed. Schedules were erased. One aide was overheard muttering, "She's going to blow it all up." So what exactly happened? Why would a country like Australia, one with deep royal roots, historical ties to the British Crown, and a population once smitten by Harry and Meghan's charm offensive in 2018, refuse them now? What shifted between the glowing headlines of modern royals to the sharp editorial rebukes of brand over duty? And even more crucially, what does this mean for Harry and Meghan's increasingly fragile global relevance? Because make no mistake, this wasn't just a missed PR opportunity. This was a full-scale rejection, not by tabloids or palace courtiers, but by a sovereign nation. A nation that once treated them like royalty and now won't even return their calls. But to truly understand why this matters now, you have to go back. Back to the Australian tour of 2018, where it all began. Back to when Meghan was pregnant. The cameras were following every step, and the public narrative still clung to optimism. That trip wasn't just a diplomatic box-checking exercise. It was a coronation of sorts. The couple weren't just visiting. They were being adored. The press declared them the fresh face of the monarchy. Social media lit up with photos of them dancing with Aboriginal leaders, planting trees, meeting young children. A fairy tale in real time. Or so it seemed. Because underneath the flowers and smiles, something was already unraveling. Staff tensions, scheduling chaos, security incidents, and the first whispers that Meghan, despite being a new duchess, was already making demands well above her royal station. Insiders say that tour was when the Sussexes first glimpsed their power outside of the palace, and they never forgot it. But here's the twist, neither did the palace. Behind the scenes, a quiet storm was brewing. William and Charles reportedly bristled at the celebrity circus that followed the couple across the Pacific. Meghan's insistence on filming select moments, even when discouraged. The branded wardrobe deals that mysteriously emerged online after each outfit debut. The constant reshuffling of press access. It was a new kind of royal show, and not everyone in the firm was clapping. So fast forward to now. 7 years later. The Sussexes are no longer working royals. They've launched a podcast, a documentary, a memoir, and 1,000 controversies. And now they want back in. Not into the palace. They've made that clear, but into the public stage. The global spotlight. And what better stage than Australia, the very country where their legend first bloomed. But Australia said no. Not loudly, not cruelly, just no. The government's response was so quiet, it was almost strategic. No official comment, no rejection letter, just a series of delayed replies, rescheduled meetings, and eventually, radio silence. And that silence, according to sources, was deafening inside Camp Sussex. Because here's the thing, Harry and Meghan don't do well with silence. They thrive on narrative, control, spin, and suddenly, one of the biggest English-speaking nations in the world wasn't playing along. Now, reports from insiders claim Meghan wanted to take matters into her own hands, that she felt Australia owed her another chance, that this wasn't just about charity or goodwill, it was about legacy, and perhaps more importantly, optics. One source close to the situation claimed, Meghan believed Australia was their redemption arc, a global reset. She had plans, big ones. So what kind of plans? And what exactly triggered the rejection? That's where things get complicated and dangerous, because multiple layers are at play here. From diplomatic tensions between the Commonwealth and the Crown, to the rise of Republican sentiment in Australia, to the sheer unpredictability of Meghan's brand strategy. which, according to some, has gone from royal adjacent to full-on celebrity empire building. Australia, it seems, wasn't interested in being part of the next Netflix special. Not again. And this is where the story takes an even more fascinating turn. Because the rejection didn't just come from government officials or behind closed-door staff. It came from the public, too. Australian talk shows began subtly mocking the proposed visit. Journalists questioned the couple's motives. Social media erupted with hashtags like #StayHomeSussex and #NotAnotherTour. Even local Indigenous leaders, who once welcomed the couple warmly, began voicing doubts about performative activism. So what went wrong? How did the golden couple of 2018 become diplomatic liabilities by 2025? Well, we'll get into that. Because what follows isn't just a story of a rejected royal tour. It's a story of two people caught between worlds, too famous to be ignored, too controversial to be embraced. It's about the fine line between service and spectacle, between legacy and ego. And it's about the quiet rebellion of a country that chose dignity over drama. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because before we dive into government memos, furious Montecito tantrums, or secret backroom calls between Buckingham Palace and Canberra, there's something else you need to know. This wasn't just about Harry and Meghan being rejected. This was about them being replaced. Because while the Sussexes were planning their unofficial Australian tour, another royal was being quietly elevated. One younger, less flashy, but far more palatable to both the palace and the Commonwealth. And that name, Charlotte, will come up again. But first, we need to revisit the glory days. Before the storm, before the scandals, before the headlines turned brutal. We need to go back to Australia 2018, when Harry and Meghan were still royal, still adored, and still riding high on a wave of global goodwill. Because only by seeing how high they rose, can we begin to understand just how far, and fast, they've fallen. And just when you think you've heard it all, what Meghan allegedly threatened to do if they were rejected again would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What does it feel like to be adored by a continent? To walk into a foreign land and be greeted like a returning monarch, not out of duty, but love? That was the story of Harry and Meghan in Australia, October 2018. A dazzling royal tour that began with ocean breezes and ended with political aftershocks still rumbling beneath the surface in 2025. But it didn't start in scandal. No, it started with hope, with handshakes, hugs, and helicopter shots of glowing crowds. With a baby announcement that was meant to seal their fairy tale. But did it? Or was it the first act in a very different story? A story of ambition, disruption, and a slow-motion royal unraveling? Let's rewind to that electric moment. October 15th, 2018. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex step off the plane at Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport, hand in hand, smiles wide, barely 12 hours after Kensington Palace confirmed Meghan's pregnancy. It was a strategic masterstroke. The timing, the optics, the choreography, a glowing duchess, a protective prince, and a country already brimming with affection for the royals. The baby news wasn't just well received, it was seismic. The Australian press exploded with front pages. New royal down under. A baby for the modern royals. Diana's grandchild to be born in spring. And the public? Utterly besotted. Thousands lined the streets in Sydney. Children held handmade signs. Teenagers climbed lampposts to catch a glimpse. Older Australians, many of whom remembered Diana's visit in 1983, wiped tears from their eyes. In those first few days, it seemed like the monarchy had pulled off something miraculous. Relevance, energy, emotion. And Meghan? She glowed. Literally. Wearing a white fitted dress from Australian designer Karen G, she stood on the steps of the Sydney Opera House beside Harry, beaming as the harbor wind fluttered around them like something out of a movie. She was pregnant, radiant, and newly royal. This wasn't just a state tour. It was a coronation of culture. She wasn't just a duchess, she was the Duchess. An American, biracial woman, breaking centuries-old traditions with every step she took in heels across red carpets laid on Aboriginal land. The world watched. The headlines roared. And yet, behind those glowing optics, palace insiders were already on edge. Because the planning of this tour had been anything but smooth. According to former staffers, Meghan had pushed for numerous changes to the itinerary, sometimes at the last minute. She wanted more time with local creatives, more unscripted moments, more authentic scenes. One aide described her requests as nonstop curveballs. Harry, reportedly eager to please and high on adrenaline, supported her every ask. But the British royal household? Less amused. One insider leaked to the press months later that Meghan's behavior during this tour had been described as difficult and demanding behind closed doors, though never publicly. Not then. The public narrative was still glowing, but friction was already brewing beneath the surface. Take, for instance, the royal engagement in Dubbo, a regional town in New South Wales hit hard by drought. On the surface, it was one of the tour's highlights. Harry hugged a farmer and teared up during a speech. Meghan baked banana bread. The media called it relatable, genuine, touching. But what didn't make the front page? That Meghan had refused to use the official royal car. That she brought a private camera crew to record behind-the-scenes footage, something strictly against royal protocol unless pre-approved. And more importantly, that the footage wasn't just for keepsake purposes. It was for a pitch. You heard that right. According to multiple unconfirmed reports that surfaced later in 2020, long after the couple stepped down as working royals, some of that behind-the-scenes footage was eventually repurposed into the couple's Netflix docuseries deal. But back in 2018, no one was asking those questions. Instead, the couple was riding high. They visited Bondi Beach, where they sat in a circle with mental health advocates and smiled for the cameras. They walked hand in hand through Fraser Island. They watched the Invictus Games and kissed in front of stadiums full of cheering veterans. It was all so carefully cinematic, so deliberately crafted. And for Meghan, it was transformative. Privately, insiders say, this was the trip that changed everything. Because it wasn't just a royal tour, it was a revelation. A confirmation of what she already suspected. That she didn't need the palace's permission to command a crowd. That she could do this, better, sharper, and more authentically, if she had full control of the narrative. It was Australia that taught Meghan that lesson. And it was also Australia that began to teach Harry something far more dangerous. That perhaps he didn't need the royal family anymore. Because the crowds weren't cheering for the monarchy. They were cheering for him. The people's prince. The soldier. The rebel. The man who broke the mold. And when paired with Meghan, beautiful, articulate, American, it was dynamite. They weren't just royals anymore. They were a movement. But the royal family doesn't do movements. They do monarchy. And back in London, that movement was already being viewed with suspicion. Charles, reportedly alarmed by the level of attention his son was receiving. William, said to be concerned that the Sussexes were overstepping the purpose of the tour. And the Queen? She stayed silent, as she always did. But courtiers whispered. Emails were sent. Tones shifted. And by the time Harry and Meghan wrapped up their 16-day tour in New Zealand, the energy in the palace had cooled. According to one source, an aide close to William allegedly remarked, "They've gone Hollywood." It's not sustainable. Still, for the Sussexes, the tour felt like a crowning triumph. But what they didn't know is that the very tour they viewed as their royal peak was already being used against them behind the scenes. Because back in the UK, private reports were being compiled. Reports about Meghan's treatment of staff. Reports about missed engagements and changing security protocols. Reports that, one day, would find their way into the public sphere. But in October 2018, all was still light. The final days of the tour ended with a flurry of goodwill. The couple planted trees in Wellington. They wore matching lace. They left gifts for the children of Christchurch. And then they boarded their plane and flew home to London, believing they had cemented their position as the future of the monarchy. But they hadn't. Not quite. Because what Harry and Meghan didn't realize then was that they had already crossed an invisible line. They had used their royal platform not just to represent the crown, but to elevate their own star. They had built a brand. And that brand, fueled by Australia's adoration, would soon become too big to contain. Too loud. Too unpredictable. Too uncontrollable. And therein lay the problem. The palace doesn't reward unpredictability. It contains it. Which is why, less than 6 months later, stories of Meghan's diva behavior began leaking to the press. And just over a year later, they were gone. Gone from the palace. Gone from the working royal roster. Gone from the system that once put them on that sunny stage in Sydney. But the Sussexes never forgot Australia. They never forgot the cheers. the headlines, the sense of being wanted, which is why, 7 years later, they try to go back. But this time, the cheers were gone, the headlines were colder, and the doors slammed. But before that rejection unfolded, before Australia made its quiet but devastating decision, not everyone was against the Sussexes. Not at first, because while the couple plotted a second visit, someone else was already watching, and that someone had their own agenda. Someone Harry once trusted. Someone who had access to the very tour reports that Meghan believed were buried forever. And what they would do next would expose the real reason Australia said no. What happens when a former prince tries to go rogue and gets blocked at the border? You'd expect diplomatic uproar, tabloid chaos, international finger-pointing. But instead, nothing. No outrage. No statements. Just silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. The kind of silence governments use when they don't want to cause offense, but they absolutely want you to get the message. That's what Harry and Meghan got from Australia. A velvet-gloved rejection. No official denial. But no warm invitation either. No offers to host. No plans to coordinate. No requests to schedule events. Behind the scenes, the answer had already been delivered. Quiet. Firm. Undeniable. But why? Why would Australia, a nation that once rolled out the red carpet, draped the Harbour Bridge in Union Jacks, and hailed Harry and Meghan as modern-day royals, now turn the other way? To understand that, you have to see how this rejection unfolded. Not in one explosive moment, but as a slow, strategic freeze-out. Let's rewind to late 2024. Sources say Harry and Meghan's team made initial outreach to the Australian High Commission. The plan was to propose a semi-official charity and culture tour, no royal backing, but with the intent to build community goodwill. No palace involvement, but every photo would scream royalty. A win-win. Or so they thought. But the High Commission didn't bite. Their first response was polite, thanking the couple for their interest, noting the busy scheduling landscape. Translation? No. The Sussex camp tried again. This time with specifics. A wellness retreat visit in Byron Bay, a roundtable with Indigenous youth leaders, and a rumored sit-down with key environmental activists to highlight Harry's Invictus Foundation work. Still nothing. Not even a firm no. Just more delay. That's when it hit them. Australia wasn't going to say no. They were going to make them give up. Insiders close to the Montecito team say Meghan was stunned by the cold reception. She reportedly told aides, "We're trying to help, not cause trouble." But that's exactly how officials in Canberra saw it. Not as help, but as trouble. Because here's the thing. Australia is changing. The monarchy's grip on the public imagination has been quietly loosening for years. The Queen's death accelerated that process. Republican sentiment has surged. Polls now show that nearly half of Australians want a future head of state from their own country, not from Buckingham Palace. In that environment, hosting a pair of runaway royals, no longer endorsed by the crown but still draped in its symbolism, would be a political minefield. One senior Australian official reportedly put it bluntly during a private strategy call. "We have enough domestic headaches. We don't need imported drama." But there was another layer. A deeper, more awkward reason. According to sources with knowledge of diplomatic briefings, the real issue wasn't just politics. It was perception. The Australian government was concerned, deeply concerned, about being used as a backdrop for the Sussexes' ongoing global brand campaign, used as a platform to rehabilitate their image without any official oversight, used as set decoration in the next Netflix production, podcast rollout, or clothing brand tie-in. Because while Harry and Meghan spoke of service and connection, their history told a more complicated story. Officials remembered 2018. They remembered the disorganization, the media flare-ups, the subtle but constant undermining of royal protocol. One diplomat even described it as chaotic but camera-ready. The fear this time? That chaos would return, but without the buffer of royal handlers to contain it. And so, the answer became clear. Keep them at arm's length. Privately, politely, but absolutely. And it worked. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team began exploring alternative routes. Could they go purely private? Book events independently? Pay for their own security and hope the press followed? But even that posed problems. Because without official government involvement, local councils would be responsible for security, logistics, and potential protests. Risk assessment after risk assessment came back with red flags. One internal document, seen by an Australian media outlet but never published in full, warned, "The Sussexes are high-profile but no longer protected. Their presence would require extensive resources without clear diplomatic benefit. Public response likely to be polarized." Translation: they're famous, they're messy, and they're not our problem. And just when things couldn't get more awkward, another complication emerged: the palace. Yes, the very institution Harry and Meghan had stepped away from years earlier. Because while the Sussexes were quietly lobbying for access, Buckingham Palace had been doing its own background work. According to insiders, King Charles had been informed, through unofficial channels, of the proposed Australia visit. And his response? Silence. No endorsement. No opposition. Just complete neutrality. But that silence came with consequences. Because without the palace's support, Australia had no incentive to play along. No royal legitimacy to justify the visit. No crown-sanctioned tour to organize. And without that royal context, what were Harry and Meghan really? Just celebrities. Controversial ones. With a media track record that now included allegations of privacy breaches, lawsuits against UK tabloids, and an ever-growing list of headline spats, from Spotify to the royal family itself. Hosting them wasn't just diplomatically risky. It was politically radioactive, especially in a nation still wrestling with its colonial past, its future as a constitutional monarchy, and its relationship with Britain itself. Now ask yourself this: why would any leader risk that chaos? Why would Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, whose government had quietly prioritized the Republic debate, want to share a stage with a couple who couldn't even guarantee they wouldn't drag the crown into a fresh media war? The answer is simple: he wouldn't. And so he didn't. He stayed quiet. Let the silence do the work. Let the Sussexes figure it out. And figure it out they did. Because that's when Meghan, according to one Montecito source, lost it. She couldn't believe Australia, a country that once gave her standing ovations and emotional outpourings, would now treat her like a liability. She felt betrayed, the source said, like they'd turned their back on her for choosing herself. And so she shifted gears, from diplomacy to defiance. One proposal floated: to visit anyway, to do a completely private tour, book their own venues, hire their own press. But that plan carried risk. No royal branding, no government security, no diplomatic immunity, and worst of all, no guarantee the public would show up. Because here's what Australia was whispering in quiet corners: we loved them once, but now, we're not sure who they are anymore. Was this a royal couple? A media company? A political statement? The lines had blurred too far. And in that blur, Australia had chosen distance. Still, the Sussexes weren't ready to walk away. Because Meghan had one more card to play. Not a press release. Not an Instagram post. A phone call. Direct. Strategic. Calculated. And that call would trigger the most unexpected twist in the saga. Because while the Australian government thought they'd quietly closed the door, Meghan had just found a window. And what she did next would set off alarms in Canberra and send shockwaves straight back to Buckingham Palace. What if Australia wasn't just another Commonwealth nation to Harry and Meghan, but the key to their entire comeback strategy? What if this wasn't about charity, diplomacy, or goodwill at all, but about something far more calculated, far more lucrative, and far more dependent on optics than anyone realized? Because when Meghan picked up that phone, after weeks of non-answers, delayed responses, and diplomatic brush-offs, she wasn't calling to plead. She was calling to pivot, to transform rejection into opportunity, to turn silence into leverage. And that phone call, according to insiders, revealed exactly why Australia mattered so desperately to Meghan in the first place. Here's the truth most people haven't heard. Australia wasn't the destination. It was the launchpad, a warm, wealthy, brand-friendly English-speaking market with massive media reach and a soft spot for celebrity stories. A country that had once embraced her as not just a royal, but as an icon, a modern woman who represented diversity, change, and glamour. In 2018, Meghan discovered something in Australia that she hadn't found in Britain and wouldn't fully receive in America until Netflix came calling. Influence. Real, measurable, commercial influence. Australia had shown the world what a Meghan-led monarchy could look like. And more importantly, how the public responded to her brand when it wasn't constrained by British tradition. She never forgot it. And in 2024 and 2025, at a time when her career was shifting, her partnerships were uncertain, and her public perception was wobbling, that memory became gold. So what did Meghan plan for Australia? Everything. But let's start at the beginning of her Hollywood blueprint. Because the plan she designed didn't start with the Australian government. It started in Los Angeles boardrooms. Executives, producers, streaming strategists, digital marketing teams, the people who build legacies. Not through palace ceremonies, but through global franchises. And Meghan, ever aware of the changing media landscape, knew she needed a comeback arc, something that could shift the public narrative, something that was emotional, global, and photogenic, something that connected her humanitarian brand with her celebrity allure. Enter Australia, a country with stunning landscapes, diverse communities, and a history of royal fascination. A country where she and Harry once dominated headlines for 16 days straight. A country still emotionally tied to Diana, whose ghost follows the Sussex brand everywhere they go. And here's the twist. According to multiple insiders, Meghan's team had been quietly developing a concept internally, long before the governments got involved. A new global lifestyle and humanitarian initiative. Part documentary, part philanthropy tour, part brand relaunch. Working title: Reclaiming the South Pacific. Some sources say it had a different internal name, the Renewal Tour. Regardless of the label, the intention was clear. Meghan wanted to reintroduce herself not as a disgraced royal, not as a Netflix personality, not as the controversial woman behind Spare, but as a global humanitarian leader. And Australia was the centerpiece. Why? Because America loves a comeback story. Britain loves a royal scandal. But Australia? Australia loves authenticity. It was the one place where Meghan could be a breath of fresh air instead of a gust of controversy. At least, in her mind. But this is where the contradictions begin to appear. Because while Meghan's public message was all about philanthropy, her private plan was about multimedia domination. There were discussions, informal, but serious, about partnering with Australian networks, collaborating with local Indigenous artists, launching a new signature philanthropic brand with environmental messaging, even trademarking phrases tied to the Australia-Pacific region. Some insiders say Meghan envisioned a hybrid of the Obama Foundation's global tours and Gwyneth Paltrow's wellness empire. Humanitarianism meets Hollywood. Service meets celebrity. Royal legacy meets brand identity. But here's the uncomfortable question. Was any of this actually about Australia? Or was Australia simply a stage? Because another detail leaked from inside Montecito, one not picked up by mainstream media, suggests something even bigger. A new streaming deal. Netflix, insiders say, had been cautiously supportive of the Sussexes, but results were inconsistent. Their first projects brought massive attention, later ones, less so. There were whispered concerns about creative direction, audience fatigue, and brand confusion. Meghan needed a win. A visual win. Something emotionally powerful, culturally meaningful, and globally marketable. A Sussex return to Australia. Filmed tastefully, framed strategically, and edited cinematically, would have delivered exactly that. Imagine the shots. Meghan barefoot on Bondi Beach, listening to women's stories. Harry visiting wildfire recovery zones, speaking with firefighters. The couple holding koalas, hugging children, planting trees. The parallels to Diana would have been unmistakable. The optics would have been irresistible. And Meghan understood that. But here's the twist Australia saw coming and desperately wanted to avoid. This wasn't going to be a royal tour. It was going to be a Netflix tour, disguised as charity. A brand-building expedition with diplomatic undertones. A celebrity documentary packaged as humanitarian service. And governments do not like being used as set pieces, especially not by individuals who cannot offer official royal endorsement, cannot guarantee political neutrality, cannot detach their presence from controversy. But Meghan wasn't thinking in political terms. She was thinking like a producer, like a director, like a woman whose brand required a blockbuster reset. And Australia was her blockbuster. She saw coastline drone shots. She saw Oprah-worthy interviews. She saw global coverage. She saw magazine covers with sunlit backgrounds and inspirational quotes. But what the Australian government saw wasn't opportunity. It was liability. Interference. Unpredictability. One internal Australian briefing reportedly described the Sussexes as privately determined, publicly sympathetic, and politically risky. Another warned, they do not represent the Crown. They do not represent the government. They represent themselves. That was the issue. Australia likes clarity. And there was nothing clear about the Sussexes anymore. Not their role, not their purpose, not their intentions. And then came the moment that sealed everything. A representative of Meghan's team allegedly requested a coordinated media environment for the visit. In plain English, prearranged coverage, approved camera crews, managed crowd access, controlled messaging. It was the Hollywood model, not the diplomatic one. And that was the turning point. Australia said no, but quietly, politely, strategically. Meanwhile, Meghan still believed the plan could work. Because she wasn't counting on government approval. She was counting on the public. She remembered the cheers from 2018, the crowds, the signs, the emotional hugs, and she believed, deeply, that Australia still loved her. But did they? Or had public perception shifted too drastically? Were Australians ready to embrace a Sussex return? Or had the world turned the page? That uncertainty, combined with the growing diplomatic pushback, forced Meghan into a corner. And that's when she made her next move. One bolder, one riskier. One that would pull Hollywood even deeper into the political mess. Because if the government wouldn't support her tour, she would find someone else who could. And that someone was a Hollywood titan. One whose name alone could shift narratives, open doors, and ignite controversy across continents. And their involvement would not only complicate Meghan's plan, it would expose it, in ways no one, especially Meghan, ever expected. They wanted headlines. They got humiliation. For Harry and Meghan, the plan had been simple. Control the narrative, stage the comeback, and let Australia set the stage for their rebrand. But what they didn't count on, the story slipping through their fingers, leaked, distorted, and turned against them in a matter of days. Because just as Meghan was securing secret Hollywood backing to force the tour forward without official support, someone on the inside hit send. And what leaked? A press strategy. Detailed, polished, and damning. Not just a rough idea or a concept deck, but a full-blown communications playbook. One that revealed how Harry and Meghan's camp intended to choreograph their return to Australia down to the minute. The language in the document was striking. Phrases like high-value image opportunities, emotionally optimized content sequences, and symbolic reconnection moments with key cultural groups were sprinkled throughout the plan. This wasn't just PR. This was precision branding on a royal scale. And once the strategy leaked, the illusion shattered. Gone was the narrative of humble humanitarian service. What remained was a blueprint for a cinematic redemption arc, complete with prearranged interview slots, influencer tie-ins, and directives for favorable social media amplification. Worse still, the document had headers marked Confidential, Sussex Global Initiative. It included names of PR firms, stylists, security contacts, and even suggested hashtags to be rolled out globally at key moments during the proposed visit. Hashtag Reclaim the Crown. Hashtag Return to Oz. Hashtag Royals Reimagined. And then, the line that truly lit the media aflame. Stage 4. Spontaneous moment capture. Ensure pre-placed videographer is present for emotional moment with local children, potentially indigenous welcome ceremony. Boom. That was it. That one line. Framing what should have been a sacred cultural interaction as a planned viral moment, ignited a firestorm. Journalists pounced. Indigenous leaders were outraged. Australian media outlets ran the story with explosive headlines. Staged royalty? Meghan's PR playbook for Oz. Service or spectacle? Emotional moments. Scripted. Talk shows exploded with debates. Was this manipulation? Was it just smart media planning? Had the line between philanthropy and performance finally been crossed? And the bigger question no one could answer. Who leaked it? Some pointed fingers at disgruntled staffers from within Meghan's Montecito operation. Others speculated it came from inside one of the involved PR agencies. A few believed the leak came from Australia itself. Someone who had been approached early, grew uncomfortable, and quietly blew the whistle. But regardless of origin, the damage was done. And Meghan's reaction? Explosive. According to a source inside the Sussex team, she was shaking with fury when the documents went public. She demanded to know who had betrayed her. There were emergency calls, lockdown meetings, legal teams on standby. But the problem wasn't just the leak. It was the perception. Because up until that point, Meghan and Harry had managed to maintain a delicate balancing act. Royal enough to be taken seriously, independent enough to break rules, glamorous enough to trend. But now? Now the mask had slipped. Now the world saw the machine. The calculated moments. The packaging of emotion. The commodification of compassion. And Australia? Australia recoiled. Local politicians went radio silent. Tourism boards distanced themselves. Cultural leaders publicly criticized the Sussexes for treating lived experience as a branding opportunity. And behind the scenes, the final nail was hammered in. One Australian senator reportedly remarked in a closed-door meeting, "We don't need a circus. We need sincerity." And just like that, support evaporated. But the Sussexes didn't retreat. Not yet. Because instead of pulling the plug, Meghan made a defiant choice. She would go louder, bigger, more visible. She instructed her team to double down on media presence. Outlets were contacted. Interviews floated. Anonymous quotes seeded. Meghan's own allies began softening the ground through op-eds praising her past work in women's empowerment and racial equality. It was the classic Hollywood response to a crisis. Control the backlash with a new wave of positive spin. But it didn't work. Because just as one fire was being smothered, another erupted. A former palace aide, one who had accompanied the Sussexes on their 2018 Australia tour, decided they'd stayed silent long enough. They contacted a prominent Australian morning show and offered an off-the-record meeting. What they brought? A voice recording. A recording taken during the final days of the 2018 tour, never released publicly, never intended for press. Until now. And on that recording, Meghan's voice. Clear, sharp, frustrated, criticizing the Australian press, expressing annoyance at what she called backwards media dynamics, allegedly mocking a local reporter's accent, and, most damning of all, describing the Australian public as performatively loyal. Boom. Again. Now the narrative wasn't just that Meghan planned emotional moments for cameras. Now she was seen, by some, as someone who didn't respect the very people she wanted to film with. The press ran wild. Some tried to defend her, claiming context, stress, pressure, even fatigue. But the damage was already spiraling. Radio hosts questioned whether Meghan had ever really liked Australia at all. A prominent Indigenous leader withdrew support for the Sussexes' proposed charity event. The same morning show that aired the leak followed up with a brutal opinion segment. "We're not extras in your royal comeback movie, Meghan." And yet, through it all, Harry stayed silent. Oddly silent. Absent from the media storm. Absent from press calls. Absent from the damage control. And that silence was noticed. Because the Harry of 2018, charismatic, engaged, disarming, was missing. In his place, a ghost prince, tucked in Montecito, out of sight, out of sync. Some speculated he was dealing with the leak's emotional toll. Others whispered of disagreements between him and Meghan on how to proceed. But the real reason wouldn't become clear for another week. Because as the media chaos built, as Australian support disintegrated, as the press strategy leaked, then backfired, Meghan made one final Hail Mary. She reached out to a Hollywood icon, a household name. Someone with deep Australian roots, an unshakable global reputation, and just enough distance from Buckingham Palace to avoid triggering protocol alarms. Someone who could lend her credibility, authenticity, and a fresh wave of press coverage. That someone was Cate Blanchett. And what happened when the Duchess of Sussex tried to enlist the Queen of Australian cinema? Let's just say, it didn't go the way Meghan expected, and the fallout would echo across the Pacific. While Meghan tried to charm Hollywood royalty, Buckingham Palace was executing a royal move of its own. But not with a press release, not with a statement, not even with a whisper to the tabloids. No, this was a different kind of counterstrike, one that made no sound, left no trace, and drew no attention until it was far too late to stop. Because while Meghan and Harry were scrambling to revive their Australian tour, the palace wasn't scrambling at all. They were watching, waiting, and maneuvering with brutal precision. It's a tactic the firm has used for centuries. Do nothing, and in doing so, say everything. Let your enemies spin, stumble, and self-destruct, while you quietly prepare the ground beneath them to collapse. And this time, that ground was Australia. Let's rewind to the moment Meghan reached out to Cate Blanchett. According to industry insiders, Meghan's team arranged a private call, pitching a collaborative appearance at a women's leadership event that would coincide with the Sussexes' potential visit. The aim? Use Blanchett's unimpeachable Australian reputation to provide cover for Meghan's return. A soft power alliance. Meghan would bring global press. Cate would bring local credibility. It was clever. It was bold. And it was instantly noticed by the palace. Because Cate Blanchett isn't just a two-time Academy Award winner. She's a goodwill ambassador for the UNHCR. A respected humanitarian. And more importantly, someone with long-standing ties to royal patronages. She'd once attended a private Buckingham Palace dinner. She'd met Charles. She'd exchanged letters with Camilla about refugee work. In short, she was untouchable. And the moment Meghan tried to recruit her, alarms quietly went off in royal corridors. That's when the palace moved. Not with a command, not with a threat, but with a call. A discreet, high-level conversation between a senior royal aide and a trusted Commonwealth diplomatic liaison. A conversation that, according to a well-placed source, lasted under 7 minutes, but changed everything. Because when the call ended, a very clear message had been relayed to Canberra. The Sussexes do not represent the crown. That sentence, just 7 words, delivered with no drama, no hostility, no overt instruction, was all it took. And suddenly, everything shifted. Behind the scenes, Australian cultural ministers began quietly walking back any tentative support. Media partnerships were paused. Meetings were cancelled. Tour-related interest inquiries from Sussex PR firms were marked as non-actionable. The Australian government, which had until then simply been cautious, now became deliberate. They didn't just avoid endorsing the tour. They began ghosting it. And that wasn't an accident. Because Buckingham Palace wasn't just neutral. They were executing strategy. Call it soft sabotage. Call it passive resistance. Call it royal chess. But it was working. And the person reportedly orchestrating it wasn't King Charles. It wasn't even William. It was Princess Anne. That's right. The Princess Royal. The most understated, overworked, and ruthlessly effective member of the royal family. While others gave speeches and posed for portraits and built relationships. Decades-long ties to Commonwealth officials. First-name rapport with foreign ministers. An unglamorous but unbreakable network of influence that quietly keeps the monarchy's farthest-flung connections in check. And she was watching Meghan closely. Sources say, and had been briefed on the Sussex tour rumors as early as mid-2024. She'd read the leaked press strategy. She'd seen the footage from 2018. She knew exactly what was at stake. And she didn't like it. Because to Anne, this wasn't just about Meghan. It was about precedent. Allowing a non-working royal to organize a self-directed international tour, using their former titles, implying official representation, and wrapping it all in a commercial package, that was a constitutional powder keg, especially in Australia, especially now. So, and did what Anne always does. She acted, not by calling out Meghan publicly, not by briefing the press, but by activating her network. One by one, quiet conversations began. Between royal aides and Commonwealth liaisons, between charity heads and event organizers, between palace veterans and local Australian influencers. The message? Simple. Do not legitimize this visit. And across Australia, doors began closing. Subtly, calmly, unapologetically. Event invites were rescinded. Sponsorship discussions dried up. Potential venues suddenly had scheduling conflicts. And Meghan had no idea why. Because from her side, nothing had changed. She was still pushing forward, still believing that public affection and Hollywood glamour would overpower diplomatic nerves. She'd even prepared new wardrobe fittings. She'd confirmed makeup artists. Her Montecito team had begun pre-drafting a blog post for the visit, tentatively titled, "Coming Full Circle, Returning to the Place It All Began." But the circle wasn't closing. It was shrinking, and Meghan wasn't the only one feeling the squeeze. Inside the palace, Charles remained publicly distant, but privately satisfied. He didn't need to oppose his son. He didn't need to issue statements or intervene directly, because Anne was doing the work. And the beauty of the strategy? It wasn't traceable. There were no fingerprints, no denials, no declarations, just absence, no support from government, no logistical infrastructure, no media coordination. And that left the Sussexes exposed, drifting between royal identity and celebrity clout, with neither system willing to fully embrace them. And yet, even as the palace pulled strings in the shadows, even as Anne's diplomatic quiet storm rolled through Australia, even as local enthusiasm cooled to sub-zero, there was one wild card no one anticipated. A wild card Meghan had counted on. A wild card that now, shockingly, refused to be played. Cate Blanchett. Because just days after Meghan's team made their pitch, Kate's team sent their reply. A polite, professional, airtight no. No involvement. No appearance. No quote. No comment. Just silence. And if that wasn't devastating enough, Kate's next move was pure ice. At a private event in Sydney, just 2 weeks later, Blanchett gave a speech about leadership in the arts. She ended it with a subtle but unmistakable line. True service is quiet. It doesn't arrive with cameras or scripts or hashtags. It simply shows up and listens. The room went still. No names were mentioned. No fingers were pointed. But everyone understood. And just like that, Meghan's final Australian lifeline disappeared. Blanchett had drawn a line. Australia had drawn a line. And the palace was already preparing their next move. Because while the Sussexes licked their wounds in California, Camilla, Queen Consort, longtime power behind the throne, was making her own quiet overtures. Not to Australia, but to someone else. A rising star within the royal ranks. Someone the public adored. Someone media-savvy, politically neutral, and perfectly poised for a new Commonwealth role. And who was that someone? Princess Charlotte. And what she was about to be offered would not only derail Meghan's global tour dreams, but reframe the entire future of the monarchy. What do you do when the world slams its doors in your face? If you're Meghan Markle, you plan your own entrance. Bigger, louder, and impossible to ignore. Because after the rejection by Australia, the leaked press strategy debacle, the quiet royal sabotage from Princess Anne, and Cate Blanchett's frosty refusal, most would have backed off, retreated, regrouped. But not Meghan. No. According to multiple insiders close to the Sussexes media circle, what came next wasn't retreat. It was retaliation, and it had a name. The Revenge Tour. Now, was that the official term? No. But within media and political circles, that's what it began to be called behind the scenes. A whisper of warning. A coded phrase that signaled something dangerous was brewing beneath Meghan's carefully curated image of global grace. Because what Meghan allegedly planned next was unlike anything the royals, or the Australian government, had seen before. No diplomacy. No permissions. No subtle nods to the crown. This would be a self-funded, self-filmed, star-powered campaign designed not just to visit Australia, but to bypass every institution that told her no. A full-fledged media assault. But first, she needed ammunition. That's where her new team came in. Sources say that in early 2025, just weeks after the Australian cold shoulder reached its peak, Meghan quietly hired a new PR consulting firm. One specializing in reputation rehab, political optics, and cross-border celebrity campaigns. This wasn't a royal communications agency. This was a crisis architect's dream team. And the instructions? Reframe the narrative. Take control of the message. Make them want us back. The Revenge Tour blueprint began to form. Here's what it allegedly included. A global press campaign, strategically released in lifestyle publications, casting Meghan as the misunderstood humanitarian who simply wanted to reconnect with communities she loved. Australia was never the villain, just caught in the middle of outdated palace politics. A documentary short, already in pre-production, tentatively titled Red Soil, Open Hearts. A personal reflection on Meghan's first visit to Australia, blended with commentary on motherhood, climate action, and the pain of being silenced. A new podcast series featuring prominent Indigenous and South Pacific voices, where Meghan would act as the bridge, not the star. A series of fashion editorials, photographed in California, but inspired by the spirit of the outback. One pitch to a major magazine reportedly used the phrase, Meghan returns to her roots. Inspired by the land that welcomed her with open arms. But perhaps most shocking of all, her team's efforts to directly engage influencers and online commentators within Australia. According to leaked emails obtained by a local outlet, Meghan's media representatives offered exclusive access, interview snippets, and early content previews to select TikTok personalities, Instagram storytellers, and podcast hosts, many with strong activist or progressive followings. The strategy was clear. If the government wouldn't let her in through the front door, she'd go viral through the side windows. She would bypass tradition, bypass protocol, and most importantly, bypass the palace. But here's the kicker. This campaign wasn't just reactive. It was deeply emotional. One former team member claimed Meghan referred to Australia as the place that saw me before the world judged me. That's the thing no one talks about. For all the power plays and PR gymnastics, there was something personal at the core of this alleged revenge tour. Something raw. Because 2018 wasn't just a tour. It was the beginning of everything. The applause, the global coverage, the love, the belief that she could stand on the world stage, not as Harry's wife, but as her own force. And losing that, being shut out of it, it stung. One insider described Meghan's mindset as hurt masked by hustle. She wasn't just angry, she was heartbroken. And that heartbreak, mixed with ambition, became something volatile. But what about Harry? Where was he in all of this? Strangely quiet, increasingly absent. According to reports, Harry was uneasy with the tone of the tour plan. Not because he didn't support Meghan, but because he sensed that something was slipping. The more she pushed, the more doors closed, said one former Invictus Foundation associate. Harry, once the people's prince of the Pacific, was now watching his reputation drown in optics wars he couldn't control. And while Meghan's team pushed ahead with influencer outreach, short film drafts, and PR coordination, the palace was watching. Still silent, still neutral, but gathering everything. And they weren't the only ones. Australian newsrooms began receiving strange anonymous tips, unpublished versions of Meghan's documentary proposal, draft emails to influencers, photo mood boards for her Outback-inspired shoots, complete with branded merchandise mock-ups. Someone inside was leaking again. But this time, it wasn't just damaging. It was humiliating. Because suddenly, everything Meghan hoped to quietly release in a controlled, inspirational rollout was exposed. And the reaction? Brutal. Australian editorial columns ran with headlines like, Duchess or Diva? A tour too far? Is Meghan monetizing the Outback? Worse still, social media turned fast. TikTok creators who had once been courted began posting receipts, messages from PR teams trying to coordinate content calendars, preview scripts, and even suggested hashtags. The public saw right through it. Hashtag Revenge Tour started trending, not as a badge of strength, but as a symbol of Meghan's overreach. And yet, amid the fallout, Meghan wasn't finished. Because one final move was still in motion. A private event, scheduled for May 2025 in Sydney. Not sanctioned by the government. Not covered by major networks. But designed as an intimate gathering between Meghan and a select group of female entrepreneurs, mental health advocates, and youth leaders, many of whom had supported her in 2018. The venue was small. The guest list confidential. The security? Private. But the intention was loud and clear. It was Meghan's way of saying, you can't stop me. And that might have worked. It might have been a quiet triumph amid the chaos. A seed planted for future redemption. Except, someone else was watching from across the world. Someone who saw the entire revenge tour unfold and decided they'd had enough. Someone who knew exactly how to deliver a message that would land with more force than any press strategy, any documentary, or any influencer push. And that someone was Queen Camilla. And what she did next would take the war from whispers to all-out declarations. One dinner, one invitation, one brutal, public silence. And the Duchess of Sussex was never the same again. After months of plotting, branding, and being iced out by the Australian government, Meghan Markle believed she had finally found her Trojan horse. Not a politician, not a palace ally, but a Hollywood goddess with Australian roots and global reverence, Cate Blanchett. To Meghan, Cate wasn't just a potential collaborator. She was the missing piece, a bridge between royalty and relevance. Someone who could deflect controversy simply by being in the same room. Someone who'd walked red carpets, chaired UN forums, and given speeches in refugee camps. Someone who could co-sign Meghan's return to Australia without ever uttering a political word. The timing seemed perfect. Kate had just finished promoting a new critically acclaimed indie film. She'd been praised in Australian press for her continued activism, and she was in Sydney for a private UNHCR fundraiser. Enter Meghan. Her team quietly reached out. Not with fanfare, not with drama, with a simple pitch. We'd love to have Kate lend her voice to an upcoming humanitarian panel Meghan is assembling, one that centers women, climate, and the power of story. According to insiders close to Blanchett's team, the email was respectful, well-written, and flattering. But it landed like a thunderclap. Because inside Kate's world, Meghan's name wasn't just polarizing, it was radioactive. Let's be clear. Cate Blanchett is no royalist lapdog. She's politically savvy, unapologetically progressive, and not afraid to make a statement. But she's also careful. She guards her credibility the way the monarchy guards its secrets. And her immediate reaction to Meghan's offer? Reportedly 2 words. Not wise. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. Blanchett had seen the chaos surrounding the Sussexes' attempted Australia return. The leaks. The influencer outreach. The revenge tour, whisper campaigns. The failed soft power diplomacy. And more importantly, she'd seen how her name was already being used, without consent. Because one Sydney outlet had already reported that Meghan is said to be in talks with several leading Australian cultural figures, including UN Goodwill Ambassador Cate Blanchett. That crossed the line. Kate was furious. According to one associate, she made it clear, "You don't float my name without my blessing. Ever." Within hours, her team fired back a quiet but firm email. No thank you. No availability. Please remove Kate's name from future correspondence. But Meghan wasn't finished. Days later, at a high-profile donor dinner hosted in Sydney's eastern suburbs, packed with film executives, human rights lawyers, and high-society philanthropists, Cate Blanchett and Meghan Markle were placed at adjacent tables. Not by coincidence, by calculation. The event organizers, sensing a potential photo op, or perhaps a détente, had placed them within arm's reach. This was the moment Meghan had waited for. A chance to engage woman to woman. Not through handlers or PR firms, but face-to-face. She leaned in. Witnesses say Meghan made the first move, smiling, complimenting Kate's recent film work, casually referencing a shared contact in Los Angeles. Kate was polite, charming, even, but distant. Like ice and silk, one observer said. They exchanged no more than a few lines before Kate turned back to her table. She made no scene, but her body language told the story. This alliance will not happen. And yet, that wasn't the bombshell. That came 48 hours later. At a separate public arts event held at the Sydney Opera House, a forum on the future of storytelling in a changing world, Cate Blanchett delivered the keynote address. It was eloquent, passionate, measured, but the final paragraph sent shockwaves. Storytelling without service is marketing, she said. And marketing disguised as mission is manipulation. The room froze. No names were spoken, but everyone knew. That was a direct hit. It was the kind of line that doesn't need elaboration. The kind that slices without ever drawing blood. The kind that turns a respected actress into an oracle and leaves the Duchess of Sussex reeling in its wake. Within hours, the quote went viral. Australian media erupted. Kate's ice-cold rebuke. Blanchett shades Meghan without saying her name. Marketing or mission. Meghan under fire again. Social media piled on. Some praised Kate's restraint. Others saw it as elite hypocrisy. But one thing was clear. Meghan had lost a crucial battle in the court of public perception. Because if Australia respected anyone more than royalty, it was Cate Blanchett. And Kate had spoken. What made it worse? Meghan had no comeback. Not this time. No post. No comment. No podcast. Just silence. But behind closed doors, the tension in Montecito was said to be volcanic. A source close to the Sussexes claimed that Meghan felt blindsided, betrayed, and disrespected. She allegedly told a confidant, "Kate talks about women's empowerment, but couldn't even sit through a conversation with me? Is that sisterhood?" But the damage was already done. And across the world, Queen Camilla was watching. Because Cate Blanchett's refusal wasn't just about personal brand protection. It was a signal. A message to the palace. A torch passed from cultural royalty to actual royalty. And Camilla understood it perfectly. The Australian cultural elite were done with Meghan. Now, it was time for the crown to step back in. Not with Harry, not with William, but with someone younger. Someone who could represent modern monarchy without the noise. Someone who could command the Australian spotlight without chasing it. And Camilla had the perfect candidate. She wasn't in the tabloids. She didn't have a Netflix deal. She hadn't written a memoir. But she had the bloodline, the charm, and the training. Her name? Princess Charlotte. And the plan Camilla was about to set in motion wouldn't just silence the Sussexes. It would eclipse them. For good.